Hey guys, another day, another lesson. We've got classifying quadrilaterals today. We talked yesterday about the other day about quad meaning four. So quadrilaterals are four-sided polygons, okay? So today we're going to talk about all the different types of four-sided polygons, quadrilaterals that we are going to be dealing with, okay? This chart right here in example one is something that you'll see again. Okay, it's a different. We call it a hierarchy, or it's a layout of what the definitions are of each of these quadrilaterals and kind of where they fit into the big picture. Okay, over here we've got the trapezoid. You'll notice the trapezoid's kind of out on its own. The trapezoid is very different than most of the other quadrilaterals that we're going to talk about. It is a quadrilateral because it has four sides, but it's not really connected to any of the others. He is kind of an outlier, a loner a little bit. Okay, so a trapezoid, it says a quadrilateral with exactly one pair of opposite sides parallel. So exactly one pair means only one pair. So if we look at these line, this here and this line here, okay, those are parallel, as in if they were to keep going, both of these lines, they would never touch ever. All right, so it is a trapezoid if there's pair, only one pair of opposite sides being parallel, only one. Okay, so then when we talk about our quadrilaterals, we're talking about four-sided figures there. Okay, so we have this quadrilateral right here, and now we go down to the first example, which is a parallelogram. Okay, parallelogram has parallel in there, which is a big thing for the parallelograms because the definition of it is it's a quadrilateral, four sides, with opposite sides congruent and parallel. So if we look here, this side is opposite of this side. They are the same size, congruent sides, okay, and they're also parallel. Now, if we look here across from this, these are opposite sides here, this line and this line. They're parallel and they are congruent, the same in size, right? So that makes this a parallelogram. Now, anything that is connected underneath of it is also an example of a parallelogram. All right, we're so used to a shape just being one shape. All right, but a parallelogram, these are all underneath it different examples of parallelograms. Okay, now we'll start with a rectangle. We look at the rectangle, and a lot of us are like, I know what a rectangle is, but if I was to ask you to define what a rectangle really was, you might struggle a little bit. Okay, so they say that a rectangle is a parallelogram with four right angles. Okay, so in the definition of a rectangle, it says it is a parallelogram, which means that the opposite sides have to be congruent and parallel. So when we're talking about the definition of a rectangle, opposite sides need to be congruent and parallel, okay, and they need to have four right angles, which is these 90-degree angles like we've talked about in the past 2 days. Okay. Over here, we have a rhombus. Okay. The rhombus is, some of us look at it like, well, that kind of looks like a diamond or that kind of looks like a kite. The official name is a rhombus. All right. And a rhombus, it says it's a parallelogram with four sides that are congruent. So again, we look at all these sides are equal. All right. But it's also a parallelogram, which means has congruent sides and the opposite sides are parallel. Okay. Sorry, the opposite sides are congruent, not all of them, just the opposite sides. I'm sorry. Okay. Now, when we look down here at the square, we notice that the square, it shows a line here, which means a square is an example of a rectangle. Okay. There's a phrase that a lot of our parents talk about where we say a square is an example of a rectangle, but a rectangle is not an example of a square because a square, it says it's a parallelogram with four sides that are congruent and four right angles. Okay. So a square is an example of a rhombus and it's an example of a rectangle. Okay. If I'm looking at trying to help me to define some of these, I most often compare a parallelogram and a rectangle together because when we're drawing parallelogram, it kind of looks like somebody sat on the top of a rectangle, and it was nice and straight, and then it went boop, and it turned a little bit. Okay. Okay. So then when we talk about comparing a square and a rhombus, okay, a rhombus is kind of like somebody took a square and sat on it, all right, and made it a little slanted. Okay. So why is that helpful? Because we know a rectangle, the opposite sides are equal, and in a parallelogram, the opposite sides are equal. All right. We know with a square, all sides are equal. Okay. With a rhombus, all sides are equal. All right. So that was something that always helped me when I was trying to remember, the definition of a rhombus or the definition of a parallelogram. All right. So I'm going to move over to the next page here. Sorry, not this page, the next page. All right. And it kind of gives us some examples. And I got to hide my tools here because all my answers are there. Okay, so it's okay. These are all the answers. It says describe the attributes of each quadrilateral and then classify the quadrilateral. When it talks about describing attributes, remember we learned that attributes are traits. So what can we say about this shape? Well, I know that the opposite sides are equal. And that's really about it, right? Because we can't say that it has 90-degree angles because it does not. So when it says to classify it, we would have to say, okay, well, how do I classify if it has opposite sides are parallel and congruent? Well, that was a parallelogram, so we would say a parallelogram. Okay. On this one, for number 4, you would say, actually, I'll pop the answers up here. Okay. It says all sides are congruent. Yes, that's true. And then the opposite sides are also parallel, which makes this an example of a rhombus. All right. So when it talks about describing attributes, just tell me about the sides. What's congruent? What's parallel? What's equal? What angles are the same? Which ones are 90-degree angles? Okay. You can always put that in there when it says to describe the attributes. All right. Question number 5, it says circle the quadrilaterals that have all the attributes of a parallelogram. Well, remember, we know a parallelogram has opposite sides are parallel and congruent. So in a rectangle, opposite sides are parallel and opposite sides are congruent. All right. A rhombus, opposite sides are parallel and opposite sides are congruent. And then in a square, opposite sides are parallel and opposite sides are congruent, but not in a trapezoid. So that's why these 3 are examples of a parallelogram. And if we were to go back to the first page that we viewed, where we had this parallelogram, okay, right here, there's a line being drawn from the parallelogram to each of those 3 shapes because they are examples of a parallelogram, okay? This section in this chapter is a little bit tough, but I try to give you as much information as I could to try and help you with today's activities. I'll also post some other videos, all right? If you have any questions or comments, guys, again, just post it in the comments section for today, and look forward to hearing from you. All right, miss you guys. Take care.